We are less than a month away from the election, and just about every day leading up to it, we have another story relating to voter suppression. Now, I'm going to start off in Texas because what the Republican governor is doing there in the middle of a pandemic is frankly inexplicable. Greg Abbott, he's just issued an executive order restricting drop boxes for ballots to just one per county. If you don't know Texas, trust me, the counties are really, really big. Now, two separate lawsuits are trying to overturn that, but it is unclear whether or not that they will have a chance to alter the trajectory come November. GOP legislatures in three pivotal swing states, they're shrinking the windows for the counting of mail-in ballots before November 3rd. Instead of starting to process the ballots days in advance, they will not be allowed that lead time. And that is stoking fears that the president will try to declare victory on election night before all the votes not even are nearly counted. And his rhetoric, including at last week's debate, is fueling even more concerns.
If I see tens of thousands of ballots being manipulated, I can't go along with that. And I'll tell you what,
does that mean,
from a common sense,
does that mean you're
I'll tell
going to
you
tell
what
your
it means.
people to take to the
It means
street?
you have a fraudulent election. You're sending out 80 million ballots. They're not equipped to. These people aren't equipped to handle it, number one. Number two, They cheat. They cheat. This is not going to end well. This is not going to end well.
Well, my next guest just wrote the cover story in the recent Times Magazine, spelling out how voting is under attack and also how the allegations of voter fraud is being used to disenfranchise Americans. Jim Rutenberg, a writer at large for the magazine section. Jim, thanks for the time. Let's first start off with voter fraud because already a lot of my audience has heard a lot about it. I anticipate they're going to hear a lot more of it between now and November 3rd. You looked into it and looked at some of the more notable cases, and while each one's different, you found that there is a ton of exaggeration, if not just outright fabrication, in terms of how widespread fraud is when it comes to voting.
Right. The pattern is really clear here. You hear these stories about voter fraud and investigations, and in some cases, you even see images of police raids. And then if you follow these cases for months out, or certainly at least a year or two out, when the cameras are gone and the headlines are over, you see that these boil down to really a bunch of nothing. They got the headlines and then got to make the charges, but they never became real criminal cases. So it's very easy to lodge these complaints, and they really don't end up panning out.
And you trace it back in your piece to 2000 in an apartment or whatever, in a room in Miami. We all learned about the Blue Blazer riot or Brooks Brothers riot, whatever you want to call it here. But in Bush v. Gore, it started there. But in many ways, in the last 20 years, it certainly hasn't ended there.
Right. If people will remember, during the big Florida recount, there was a moment in Miami-Dade where a Republican protest broke out in a counting room, shut the counting down, and that canvassing board never counted again. Supreme Court came through and ruled for Bush. But what that crowd was chanting was voter fraud, voter fraud. And what it showed you is in these combative, contested elections, it really doesn't matter. There was no evidence of voter fraud in that room, but the charge alone can provide cover for, kind of extra voting to take the extra legal sort of banalities here, where it's not the vote that was counted. It was the legal maneuvering in the name of voter fraud. It's something that has nothing to do now with voters.
Jim, I spoke to a lot of folks relating to the upcoming election in terms of the integrity aspect of it. And the more I talk to them, the more worried I get, including folks from the Transition Integrity Project. And in short, you had people who've run national campaigns for both parties. You have people who are secretaries of state for both parties, red, blue states. And they went through all this different modeling, and they finally gave up because they couldn't figure out a way that this ended well. After your research for this piece, whether it's the intimidation, whether it's the suppression, whether it's the disenfranchisement, how much do you put a likelihood that we're going to have a real problem on November 3rd because we're not equipped if one side decides to say this is outright fraud, there's widespread cheating, even if there's no evidence of it?
Look, both sides, both campaigns, both parties, outside groups on both sides are girding for more post-election litigation than we've ever seen in our history. Now, that said, predictions, even this close to an election, tend to be wrong as often as not. So we'll see. There's a conventional wisdom on both sides that should a Joe Biden, for instance, win by a lot, then it will be harder for the Trump forces to contest these elections. But we don't expect that per se. And again, both sides are spending a lot of money, spending a lot of time planning to fight over what you opened the segment with. These rules changes and attempts to extend deadlines or not extend deadlines. We're all going to likely know the most picayune details about counting mail ballots in the coming weeks. And there is definitely high concern, especially I might add, among civil rights lawyers who have been litigating these cases for years. They are very concerned that there are going to be a lot of false charges about the integrity of an election to contest the results.
Okay, but that brings me to my question, and I'm not clear on what people are more worried about. Are they worried about that, we're going to have one candidate, no matter what, if he's losing, try to delegitimize the election? It'll create this doubt, and this fog will hang over the election. Or are they more concerned, especially with the appointees to some of these federal courts in the last 3 years, that even if there's no evidence, and as you showed in your long reporting here, every time it goes before the courts to prove this fraud, they can never materially produce that proof, that they can actually win in the courts and stop the ballot counting and the rest? Are they more concerned about the results or the distrust that'll be attached to the election?
I think both. For instance, look at this idea that mail balloting is incredibly fraudulent. Not true. No evidence for that. But some people may decide, well, on the Democratic side, President Trump's going to make it hard for me to vote by mail. They're going to challenge my ballot. I'm going to go in person. Say, God forbid, there's a really bad COVID outbreak on election week. That voter may just decide not to vote. So there's an effect here and now. This messaging can be suppressive. Then we get to the courts. And, you mentioned this Texas case. Look at what Texas is doing. Texas is limiting the ballot boxes based on the notion that there's fraud, that these mail drop boxes are ripe for fraud. Isn't true. That has a real world effect now. And then that will be litigated in the court. And as you mentioned, you could get some of these cases in front of very partisan judges in one way or another, and the result won't be decided on law, but based on one judge's leaning.
So the folks you spoke to, are they most concerned, and I know every state's a little different, but more broadly, that all of a sudden people show up and they're purged from the rolls? Are they more worried that you're going to have guys showing up here because of the consent decree that expired, that you're going to have widespread intimidation? Or do you think that they're really worried that, because of the one drop box or whatever else, they're going to suppress the turnout here and people won't be able to vote? What are they more worried about of those three big categories? Forget fraud, okay? But, in terms of counting a vote, which one worries people most?
I actually think it really is all three, right? I think there's, and what you put your finger on it. It's this idea that they're going to limit the votes going in. You see the Republican side very much trying to limit that window, make it as small as possible so that votes can't be counted. That's a concern for democracy, whatever side you're on. Why don't you want all the votes to be counted? Now, where there are threats of fraud, the system has to deal with that. Nobody's saying it doesn't. Everybody thinks it should. But once you start disenfranchising voters, vote by vote, which is what this effort sometimes looks like, that's a problem for democracy. So you have that's where civil rights lawyers are very concerned. Democrats, for their part, have planned out all kinds of scenarios where there's going to be harassment at the polls. They're trying to prepare for that. So, that's going to be very concerning. And again, once you get into the courts, all of this spills in and it builds upon itself.
So here's the part that I was clearly wrong about, not just how it turned out 4 years ago in the election, but I thought the girders of democracy, Jim, were so strong that no one person, especially with no real connection to a political party, could upend all this. And man, was I wrong. So to my end, I'm getting conflicting pieces of information where military leaders, including retired 4-stars, are saying no way, no how does the military go along to get along if all of a sudden the president and through the attorney general invokes, let's say, the Insurrection Act. Or there's no way that Nevada, all of a sudden, we're not going to count any of the electorate's votes, the voters. Instead, they'll elect with the state legislature, just a bunch of electors to decide who won the state, not counting a vote. I don't think those things would happen. But am I being naive? Have things just moved so beyond the norm here that people might aid and abet a hijacking of an election?
Well, this is very interesting because if you talk to the lead Democratic lawyers, they would tell you, we don't think that's going to happen. We really don't think so. But they are still preparing for it. What would have to happen, you mentioned the Insurrection Act. There are other laws that don't allow troops anywhere near polling stations. The question is, does a Bill Barr somehow give the president a temporary legal justification to use troops in that way? And this isn't conspiracy theory. The president himself has tweeted that he would like to see this happen, that he would like to be able to send troops. And he also mentioned local law enforcement, which he doesn't have control over, to polls. So this isn't theoretical, right? He has said this. But the law would not support this. The question is, would they find some legal justification to start something like that? The Democrats are very confident that once you got to the courts on something like that, troops at a polling station, they'd have a much harder time, they being Republicans, if they tried to do it, President Trump if he tried to do it. But does he try to do it is the question.
And anyone who would put it past their own possibility hasn't been paying attention. Listen, I don't know if you intended to scare the you-know-what out of me when I read your piece here, but you succeeded if you did. It is uncharted territory, what we're in right now. But great reporting, Jim. I appreciate a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, and you're looking right now at a live picture of Walter Reed Medical Center in Bethesda. Any minute now, the president is set to be released from the hospital and taken back to the White House. We're going to show it to you as it happens live. In fact, if it happens in our break, we'll cut right back in and show you, but we'll be back in 2 minutes otherwise. Stay with us.